Good morning. Before we get started this morning, I woke up Saturday not feeling particularly well. I had a very scratchy, sore throat and couldn't talk very good. And I called Holly and said, Holly's in Bowling Green with some of the kids at West End this morning, but she told her I'm not feeling very good. But I think as long as I don't get too excited, I'll be able to just get through the lesson. She said, "Can you even do that?" I said, "I better call an elder, shouldn't I? I better let them know." But I'm very thankful because I messaged the elders Saturday morning and said, "I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to preach tomorrow." Hating to do that in such last minute. And at the end of the day, Mickey called me back and said, "We've got it covered. If you need to not be there, we've got it covered. Roger's going to preach in the morning." I never heard who was even going to preach in the evening, but I'm just so thankful for this congregation that is filled with people that are ready to serve, ready to work. It is a great encouragement to me. I obviously do feel better, and that's why I'm able to be here. And Michael, I'm really sorry I drank out of that bottle of water before I set it up here. As I carried it up here, I thought, what are the chances of somebody drinking out of this? I didn't know if Michael was going to lead Thomas's song. But I am very thankful to be here with you this morning. And to jump back into our topic that we have focused on this year is igniting. And specifically this month, we're trying to grow in our desire to be trying to be more evangelistic in our life, and the way that we talk to people, the way that we think about our opportunities each day. And I wanted to take a step back just for a moment and maybe do some lessons that are a lesson that's a little bit more foundational to that. I started this lesson by just Googling quotes about faith. That's what we're going to talk about for a little while this morning is faith. And when I did that, I found some interesting things that popped up, and that is that there's a lot of misconceptions and there's a lot of different ideas about what faith is, especially in its relationship to logic. So the first one that I saw came from this man, Terry Goodkind. Terry Goodkind is an American author, and he is an objectivist. An objectivist is someone who says reality is the only absolute, and reality is not determined by an opinion. Reality is not determined by social convention, and reality is certainly not determined by divine decree. An objectivist would not believe in God. Terry Goodkind says, "Celebrating faith over reason is merely a way of denying what is in favor of embracing any whim that strikes your fancy." So if you feel like believing this, you can just stamp faith over top of it and say, "That's what proves my belief." That's what proves my view. And there's a lot of people in the world that treat faith that way. Faith is just the answer we have for things that we can't explain. Terry Goodkind says that. Oswald Chambers says it is a life of faith, not of intellect and reason, but a life of knowing what makes us go. Now, this was a Scottish evangelist from the 1800s. And this is the other side of the coin to Terry Goodkind. And again, I believe, I'm putting these up here because I believe both these quotes miss a vital point. One says faith is just the way that you prove that which you can't prove. Whenever I have something that I believe, but I can't put anything to substantiate that belief, I just say I have faith in it. But Oswald says that our life is to be not one of intellect and reason, but of faith. That would coincide with this next quote by someone we're all familiar with, Benjamin Franklin. He said, "The way to see by faith is to shut the eye of reason." What I want to look at this morning is how all of these are wrong. Every one of these views misses something vitally important about what faith is, and yet there is one that really sums it up well. Domenico Ciari is a Mexican author who said, reason and faith are both banks of the same river. They're two sides of the same coin. We've spent time this year considering all of these different apologetic lessons about how we can try to prove something. And what we're really focusing on in that proof that God exists, proof that the Bible is historically reliable. What we're really saying is, What is the evidence of that? And if you will recall back, if you weren't here for those lessons, you can go to our website, livingaschristians.com, and search those out. But we looked at things such as the teleological argument of God that looks at creation and notices in creation there is design. And so if there is design, there must be a designer behind that. There is the cosmological argument of God, which says if everything exists today, if I exist, if the world around us exists, something must have caused that, because we don't get something from nothing. And it summarizes that if there are things that exist, something must have caused them to exist. We've looked at morality and how arguments around morality question where it came from. How can we have a moral right and wrong without something that is absolutely moral? All of these views that we've looked at are good, what I'll call foot-in-the-door arguments. They're good arguments to maybe have if someone who's willing to discuss their criticisms of Christianity with you. That's a good way for us to say, can we expand this more? Can we talk more and just get our foot in the door to try and tell you a little bit about the evidence that I see? What I mean by that is the teleological argument that the design found in nature demands a designer may open a door for more study and for more conversation, but it also has a fault. Just like the cosmological and morality arguments, they have faults. And that fault is they will never reveal and they will never prove that that designer or that cause or that moral being is inherently God. The fact that there is morality in our world and absolute truths creates avenues for further communication. It doesn't prove that the God of the Bible deserves your loyalty. The reason for that is simple. God can never be boiled down and placed into a test tube. And when many people say they want evidence, that's what they're looking for. And if it could do that, if I could boil God down into something that I could just hand you, say, look, there he is, he wouldn't be God anymore. And he wouldn't be worth following. So today, we're going to be looking at an apologetic defense of our faith, which seeks to do more than just open the door, but it stands as a beacon in history. And it calls all societies and it calls all generations to its light and asks them to take notice and asks them to make a decision. This evening, we're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I hope that if you're here this morning, certainly if you're a member here this morning, I hope you will be here this evening. But if you're visiting with us this morning, I hope that you will be able to return this evening as well as we come and we look at that. But before we do that, we need to understand something so incredibly vital to the building of our faith that we can have a healthy and an uncompromised worldview that is able to look at God and hold him in his rightful place. And to do that, we have to answer this question. Do I have a reasonable faith? To answer that question, we must consider a few things about the nature of faith, the role it plays in our lives as followers, and the role that it plays in our salvation. So to begin that, we'll ask this question: what is faith? And we might, those of us who have been in the church, who have studied the Bible a long time, we might rattle off Bible verses that we just have tucked away for that question. Just Hebrews 11, verse 1, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We just ready to throw that out there. That's exactly what it means. But if that's what faith is, are we saying that faith is believing without seeing? Is that what the Bible is teaching us about faith? You want me to believe in a God I cannot see and to believe that he will reward me if I diligently seek him? That seems to say to people in this world, and sometimes it may be the very question that we're asking, I want you to believe without any evidence at all. And this is the reason why people sometimes disconnect faith from evidence, faith from reason, faith from logic, as we saw in those earlier quotes, that they don't stand together. They are diametrically opposed. Sometimes you might even hear people, even within the church, say, you know what? You're just going to have to believe it. If someone asks for evidence, then their faith is weak at best. But is that what the Scriptures display when it comes to faith? In John chapter 20, the verse that I'm very thankful that was read at the beginning of our lesson, especially in verses 30 and 31. If you just focus in on verse 30 and 31, Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John's gospel is likely one of the very last gospel accounts to be written down. And he's not writing it to other apostles. He's not writing it to Jews, considering the amount of time that he spends explaining things like Messiah or Christ and what that word means. He's writing this gospel. And some have taken the notion to believe he's writing it to give Christians something to share with the world. He's writing it so that you might be able to take this message and share it with those who need to hear what Jesus did, the good news of his life. Specifically, it seems as he was writing that so that the people around Asia, the area in which John also worked in as an elder, that they would be able to take that and preach it to unbelievers. What we just read, and then what Aiden read the full context of, followed the resurrection of Jesus, but it followed this time when Thomas is told that Jesus has been resurrected, and he said, I will not believe unless I see, unless I can touch. Now, upon this, Jesus shows up again, and when he sees Jesus and he is able to examine his body, he makes this remark, because he makes the remark that we just sang about, Lord, you are my Lord and my God. Jesus responds to that, saying, because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed. How do we do that? How do we believe without seeing? That's what I want to talk about this morning. Believing in God, in the God which I cannot see. John's answer in verses 30 to 31 is by understanding the evidence that he has left behind for us, the evidence that he has revealed to us, the testimony. That'll come in as an important aspect of our study this evening, the testimony that was recorded by eyewitnesses. Just because we have not seen something for ourselves does not mean that evidence doesn't exist. And just because we believe the evidence that does exist does not mean that we believe something without any reason or logic. In fact, faith needs two key components, one of which is evidence. The other one is reason. In John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, let me catch this up here just a little bit. Faith allows belief without seeing in aspects of our life today that might not be so religiously minded. In fact, they might not have any sort of churchy connotation to them whatsoever. We all the time employ means of which by discovering what is true in things that we have never seen, such as in court cases. No juror ever saw a defendant commit a crime in person. They never witnessed that firsthand. If they did, they would not be on the jury. They wouldn't be allowed to serve in that capacity. Yet they can believe without seeing and make a decision that is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is just really another way for us to say a faithful decision. And they do that based upon evidence and testimony, which is usually based upon eyewitnesses, but sometimes not even always eyewitnesses. Sometimes it's based upon the things that expert witnesses come in to talk about how this looks like something that bears all the signs that this must have happened, even though nobody actually saw it happen. They didn't have to be there in a murder case and see the trigger being pulled to be able to come to the conviction that these events certainly occurred the way that they are being suggested that they occurred. We use faith in our court system to say, I have examined and I can come to a convicted decision. I'm confident of it. I have faith in this outcome. What about in history? I doubt, I should use a stronger word than doubt, I know there's not a single one of us here when George Washington took the Continental Army across Valley Forge. Not a single one of us was here in that moment when that happened, but we believe that happened based upon eyewitnesses and testimonies that have been written. We believe that Julius Caesar was a real person, not just a figment of someone's imagination. Why? Why are we able to come to a conviction on those things and say, I know that this is true. I know that this is accurate. We employ matters of faith which take evidence and reason and bind them together to say, I've examined the evidence, I believe that these things really happened. Evidence works the same way in each case, allowing those who have not seen to evaluate and come to a solid conclusion. It's true in history, it's true in the court of law, it's true in our understanding of the Bible and in our discovering of the life of Jesus. John states, this is why Jesus and his signs and his words and his actions were recorded, so that those who have not actually witnessed them in their life firsthand could still come to a reasonable and logical conviction, or I should say a faith, that he was real and that the things said and done by him were worthy of our consideration. We'll just leave it at that for right now. Matthew chapter 11 is another passage that is important for us to understand when it comes to having a reasonable faith. In Matthew chapter 11, look at me in verses 2 through 6. Now when John, this is John the Baptist, now when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? Jesus answered and said to them, Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them. Blessed is he who does not take offense at me. Now, what's fascinating about this, and yes, there are several Old Testament prophecies that are wrapped up in Jesus' response, and we're going to pretty much just set those aside and not dig into that because there's something that is fundamentally happening underneath that I think is vitally important for our topic today. John, of all people, was the person that Jesus could have said, Why do you not believe? How do you not know? How do you not understand? There's nothing that I'm going to give to you. You have no excuse. But instead, yes, Jesus shows how prophecy was being fulfilled, but instead, underlying all that, he just says to the people from John, take him evidence. Take him the things that you have seen and the things that you have heard being accomplished in me. Again, we see an instruction from Scripture for people to examine, to reason, to logically dissect the things, the information that has been given to them to come up with a conclusion that they can be convicted on. This is what the Bible provides. As we read through our scriptures, evidence through eyewitness testimony of the life of Christ, external evidence outside, things recorded outside of Scripture which confirm the very things that the Bible itself reveals. You might say, well, I don't need that. I've got this and that's enough. But is that reasonable? When we can go outside of Scripture and see things that people who hated Christians said these things were true, these things happened, that is vitally important to being able to logically look at the evidences we have to say, I know the things that happened in the first century really happened. And to develop a logical response to that brings about a conviction that says, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, that he is my Lord. That brings about faith. But what this also reveals to us is that the God of the Bible never wanted us to have faith apart from evidence. If that were the case, he would just want us to be gullible. He would want us to be people who would believe anything that was suggested. As that first quote said, whatever whim fancies us, that is just what we have to believe. That's not the God of the Bible. He's never demonstrated that. I taught this same material at a small Bible study in Georgetown. And at some point, I made a comment about the fish tracks on the ceiling. And not a single kid looked up. But every adult there immediately looked up to see what fish tracks I was talking about. I always found that fascinating, that these kids, maybe they had already heard the joke before, or maybe they very quickly reason that fish don't leave tracks, certainly when they don't walk outside of water. That's gullibility. God's not calling us to be gullible, to believe that that there is some sort of fantastic events that have happened, and they are completely without reason, they are completely without any evidence. You just close your eyes and you follow. That's not what he's asked us to do. He's asked us to have faith. He's asked us to take the evidence that he has left with us, examine it, reason through it, look at it logically, be convicted by it, and respond. And that definition of faith is something we use every single day. It's also something that atheists and agnostics use as well. The atheists believe that nature alone is capable of creating the known universe, the things that we see around us. Everything occurred from chance, cosmic creation and reaction. And the very beings that we see on the world today were evolved through various millions and billions of years, and things that were weak or dying out, and things that were needing to be kind of morphed together, to be joined together through the evolutionary process in which they created the beings that we see today. They have faith in that. They may never use that word to describe that. Certainly there is evidence for some forms of evolution. There is far less evidence for others. But they take what evidence they have and the way that they are going to interpret that evidence, and they seek to build a faith off of that. It's based off philosophy, off worldview. And therefore, it is based off belief and upon reasoning of specific evidences. If anyone ever tells you that faith is foolish, understand that's a very foolish statement. It's a very foolish statement because people throughout the world use faith every day. How do you know that just 5 minutes ago you didn't just pop into existence? How do you know that you did not exist at all until right before you came into this worship service, into the Bible classes? How do we know that those things happen? How do we know that the memories that we have are not just some sort of fabricated thing that our chemicals in our brain are creating but have no substantial? How do you know that your parents are really your parents? Or we come with these questions and we go, that's absurd. Why would you even bring that up from the pulpit? It is so absurd to question those things. And that's because we're convicted on them. We're convicted on our reality. We're convicted on our heritage. We're convicted that we exist. We have so much faith in that, so much faith in these things that to go outside of it is completely unreasonable and maybe even maddening. So when someone says that they claim that faith is a completely useless tool that Christians just use to cover up foolish beliefs, they're the only ones being fooled. Faith is a tool that every single one of us uses every single day. Faith is not gullible. Faith is not blind. Faith rests upon evidence which God has provided for us. To choose to believe or not to believe, testimony of eyewitnesses. In fact, as we focus more in on we're going to use the word, the legend for our purpose of our studies. As we focus in on the legend of Jesus Christ, I think what we will find is it is a great absurdity and it is a great foolishness to say that is nothing more than a myth. It is a reasonable conclusion to say, I have faith that this man from Nazareth existed and that these things occurred around him. That brings us up to another thought. Can I have faith then without reason? Can I believe that God is, but God does not have a reason for the faith that he provides us? In Hebrews 11, verse 6, a passage that we don't always equate to. We kind of stop at Hebrews 11:1. We need to go on and read Hebrews 11:6 sometimes, because while Hebrews 11:1 gives us this sort of cookie cutter definition, we can be very quick to jump to that and say this is as a kind of a whole what faith is. We need to go on and read the rest of that passage. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, for by it the men of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible, but by faith God offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous. God testified about his gifts. And through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up, for he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleased to God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe, and he lists two things here. He must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. That implies that our faith, we use that word in many different aspects to it, that we have faith and we are of the faith, we belong to faith, that our faith is something that is necessary for us to be pleasing to God. We must believe that he is, and this is where people will say, oh, that's just where they're just taking that term faith and they're using it to prove their foolish beliefs. All right, we must believe that he is, and we can understand that there is evidence, and we can logically come to that conclusion that God exists, but it's got to be more than that. Our faith must reason through that God exists, and it must also reason through that God has a purpose. A reasonable faith believes that God is, and that God is the reason for their hope. We must believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. It's not enough just to know that God is. Faith also provides reason for the hope that we have. For many, faith has no purpose because God has no purpose. We exist, we accept that there is a God there. We have looked at all of those arguments that I said were great arguments to open the door. I look around the world and I see design and go, there has to be a designer. I look around the world and say, there's no way that all of this came from nothing. Something had to cause that. In the words of Thomas Aquinas, this cause we will call God. Okay, I can believe that. But what does that have to do with me? God, that doesn't have any implication on me whatsoever. If that's the case, then we have finished reasoning through. We don't have a reasonable faith. Reasonable faith realizes that God had a reason for creating everything that he did. The world, the things that are in it, you and me. The Bible reveals those reasons, and it brings us another aspect of reasonable faith. Reasonable faith must be acted upon. So many examples of this can be found in the Bible. If you want to turn over to James chapter 2 for a moment. James chapter 2 and verse 19. Let's start in verse 18. Someone may well say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without the works. I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. You notice that? And in James chapter 2, verse 19, the Bible tells us that the demons have a faith as well. They believe that God exists, and they shudder. They react to that. In fact, something interesting that I noticed, some people will take this passage and say the difference between us and the demons is that we obey God and they don't. Show me one example in the New Testament where the demons did not obey Jesus whenever he told them to do something. They don't have a choice in the matter. They are bound to obey him by the power that he has over them. When he says to be cast out of a person, they are cast out of a person. They might beg to which they might go from there, but they don't have a chance of standing up and saying, we're going to fight back against you on this. What's the difference between us and the demons? Reasonable faith. Faith that reasons that God exists and he rewards those who diligently seek him. He rewards those that want to belong to him. He rewards those who desire to look logically at the evidences that he has left for a very purpose, creating a person that is not just convicted, but that is being recreated in their heart and in their mind into the very image of Jesus Christ. In verse 25 of that same passage, James goes on to talk about Rahab, who was justified by works, you would think. She examined the evidence of God, the Red Sea crossing, the defeat of the mighty kingdoms of Og and Sihon. She believed, though, that it was not only God existed, she believed that the God that could do all of these things for his people, and that would spare them and that cared for them enough and that had great power, could also somehow do something for her. And that's what provoked all of her response. That's what spurred her to act counter to the culture she lived in. She sent the spies out a different way instead of turning them over. She gathered her family together into a home. She hung a scarlet cord out her window as instructed. But then we also see Paul in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, who says that we are justified by faith. Now, doesn't that seem a little bit like a contradiction to what James is saying here in James chapter 2, where he talks about works and Paul is talking about faith? Or, if we were to reason through this logically, is it possible that Paul and James understood faith the exact same way? Faith believes in God by reasoning through the evidences surrounding him. Faith believes that God is the reason for our hope. And so faith moves to work in actions that God has instructed us to belong to. In other words, just what Paul says, James also would agree with, faith justifies us. And we are eternally, our faith will have lasting ramifications. No one is asking us to sacrifice a reasonable mind to choose to believe God or to follow God, a being that you cannot see or touch. Rather, the Bible is asking you to use the evidences that our great God has made available to us, reasoning through them in our mind, examining them to his honor and to his glory. And that's what we hope to help with. And that's what we hope to learn more about tonight. Now, just for a moment, as we close all of this up, let's reason together one of those evidences. Where did this legend come from? The gospel. Where did the story come from? Who created it? There's a couple different, looking at the evidences that we have, there's a couple different conclusions that people have come up with. Some say that it is just a story that the Jews created. An uneducated Jewish peasant from a small, obscure town in Galilee claims to be the Son of God, works miracles, teaches with authority, shuts down those standing opposed to him, leading his enemies, which are, by the way, Jewish teachers, to have him arrested, charged, and crucified by Rome. 3 days later, he is reported risen from the dead. His followers soon begin to proclaim that doctrine, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ. They call it the gospel. It spreads throughout the world. It turns the world upside down. Numbers of disciples continue to grow. Did the Jews come up with that? Is this just a story that the Jews wrote? I want us to try to understand, or I want us to try to answer that question as we reason together very quickly. If the Jews came up with this story, is that a reasonable belief? What Jewish community? We step back and we just take the Jews as a whole. What do we know about the Jews? The Jews were Israelites. They were people who were in a covenant relationship with God, who had been exiled, who had come back into Jerusalem, and yet Rome, they had all these different powers that were controlling them. They longed for a Davidic king, a king from the line of David to come and vanquish their enemies and establish his kingdom. This is what they're looking for. What Jewish community comes up with the story of a poor carpenter being the Messiah and has him crucified on a Roman cross? They expected the Messiah would free them from Rome, not die at their hands. Why create a story about a man who would again condemn their traditions? He would condemn the things that they taught. He would condemn their hearts and then kill him off by Rome because, after all, we don't have the ability to do it ourselves. We tried several times and failed. Keeping in mind, they would also say this man was claiming to be the Son of God, something that was in their minds blasphemy, and is thus the reason they had him killed. Why would the Jews create this story? It's not very reasonable to think this is a story concocted of by the Jews. So maybe we take the other view and say, well, this is just a Gentile or a pagan created legend. Is that a reasonable belief that maybe the Greeks or the Romans created the legend of Jesus? Again, the notion that pagans would create a story that is filled with language that is deeply connected to Israel's history, a religion that they don't believe, they even scoff at, and they would bring up this insignificant, poor, condemned person who would go on to take notions with all of these religious practices, who would be killed as a criminal, and his raising would prove his claims that there is only one God. Again, is that a story that Rome would come up with? Rome, who believed in a pantheon of gods, or the Greeks who believed in a pantheon of gods. In Acts chapter 17, Paul speaks to these very people, Gentiles, in the very heart of Gentile philosophy, and when he gets to the part, or as he begins to start speaking to them, they say, this is a new doctrine, a strange doctrine. Certainly not something you would say if you were the one that created the story. This is a new or strange story. And as he goes in to talk about this one God who has chosen one man that he raised from the dead, they sneered and scoffed. Well, they sneer and scoff at the story that they themselves created. It is unreasonable to claim that this legend, again, we're just using that term to keep ourselves in the view of many in the world, that this legend of Jesus Christ was created by the Gentiles or that it was created by the Jews. It kind of limits our possibilities of who created the story in the first century area around Israel. If at this point we feel like saying that this is an answer that's hard to give, or a question that's hard to give an answer for. If at this point we look at this and say there's no one else that we can attribute this to except for the Jews or the Gentiles, then I want you to know that you're right where Paul was when he wrote 1 Corinthians. Right where Paul is when he said that he wanted to give a reason for the gospel message. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, let's turn over there and read that together as we start wrapping all of this up. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 25, says, "The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block and to Gentiles foolishness, but to those who are the called, both Jew and Greek, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." What Paul says is if you're trying to figure out where this story came from, and you take all the evidence, it infuriates the Jews. It causes the Greeks to say, this is the most foolish thing. Who could have come up with this story? His answer is God did. God is the only one who could have come up with this story. God is the only one who could have created it. From the beginning of time, He set this legend apart, and He created it and made it reality. That He would give His Son, the creator of all things, He would send Him to earth to do His will, being born into a poor and insignificant family of the lineage of Judah, to be raised as a carpenter, uneducated, not someone who is wildly renowned for their time spent studying under all the rabbis of the day, a person who would condemn and convict boldly those who needed to hear, and also a person who would raise up those who were hurt and afflicted. A person who would put the will of God above all else, even His own life. Out of His love for His Father, whose will He was trying to accomplish, and His love for His creation that He has made, and was seeking to recreate in His own image. God alone could come up with that story. And because of that, that story is written down and it is recorded, and eyewitnesses testify to it, and evidence is revealed for its truth, so that we might move from a place that says this is a legend into a place that says this is a reasonable fact. Jesus is the Christ, my Lord and my God. And we might have life, in the words of John chapter 20, verse 31. If you are here this morning, do you have a reasonable faith? Do you have a faith that says God is, and that Jesus is his Son? That the evidence tells me there is way too much evidence to say that couldn't be real. Do you have a faith that will prompt you to take the next step, like Rahab, who said, I know he is real. I see what he is doing, and I believe he can do that for me. You have a faith that prompts you to act, to follow in the commandments that he has provided. We would love to assist you with that this morning. It would be our greatest desire to help you to grow in your faith. If you would desire to know more about this Jesus, the Son of God, the Christ who's come to save us from our sins, we would desire to study with you and to share with you the evidences that is revealed for that. If you would like to know what he desires of you to do, to follow him, to be marked as one of his called out, belonging to him, having a heart that's been recreated in his image, we would desire to share with you that as well. If you already know those things and you are ready to come forward and to confess that you believe that and respond in baptism, to have your sins washed away, we want to assist you with that as well. Whatever we can do to help you right now, come forward and let's talk about it together as we stand and sing.